Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another wonderful tasting with the Virtual Tasting Society. I am Vadim Perlovsky, and today I'm excited to welcome a bourbon and rye brand that just about every whiskey drinker knows. Today we are trying what I, at a very young age, thought was a gateway whiskey into bourbon, and I thought this was real hard to drink. I think this was the first whiskey I ever tried. But yeah, that said, Basil Hayden is what we're trying today. And everything they release is a 40%, but we'll talk about that in a second. We have a lovely group of people joining us today. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I see a lot of familiar faces. Welcome back. Some people we haven't seen in a while. I know some people moved and are joining us for the first time in a few months. Welcome, welcome. David Donahue is the president of the LA Whiskey and Spirits Guild. And David, if you want to say a couple words.
Thank you very much, Vadim. As always, thank you for all the work and effort that you put into bringing us, these wonderful experiences. To be able to talk with someone like Edwin, who's representing a wonderful brand, Basil Hayden, it is going to be great. It's going to be a great evening. And for everybody that I haven't seen in a while, Albert, Damone, Shane, Jane, Sean, everybody. It is great to see you all again. So, thank you for being here. Really looking forward to this. And you can take it away, Vadim.
Thank you, David. Yeah, welcome back, everyone. If anyone's here for the first time, welcome. Thank you for joining us. As always, we're here to get nerdy and ask questions. So please participate, use the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself and participate. All we ask is that we're respectful of each other. So if you're not actively speaking, keep yourself on mute. But other than that, you're welcome to jump in, ask any questions, share tasting notes. That's what we're all here for. This is an interactive experience. This is not a TV show that you're just watching. Although you are welcome to eat popcorn and talk crap as long as you're on mute. So that said, Edwin Cruz is the new brand ambassador for Beam. He is the, I guess you're handling the American side of the Beam Suntory portfolio. So that's, besides Basil Hayden, that's quite a fantastic portfolio that we're excited to learn more about in the coming months. But we are starting with, as most people in the bourbon world, we're starting with Basil Hayden. It just made sense. That said, Edwin, welcome to the role. Welcome to the industry. We're excited to have you. Thank you very much for making the time for us. Tell us about yourself. Tell us about the brand. Tell us about what we're drinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Vadim, and thank you, David, for all the work that you all do and to put all this together and to host these tastings. I think they're amazing opportunities for all of us to learn. I look forward to jumping on. Like one of the big things that I've missed throughout COVID is really going to other tastings for other brands and like really understanding their process, what they're doing, how they do it, why they do it. And tasting other spirits. So it's really cool seeing all this kind of come back, not only virtually, but also in person. And I'm excited to meet all of you at some point at some in-person tasting. But for now, as far as we can do this virtually, I'm happy to do it. And like Vadim said, I'm Edwin Cruz. I'm the new American Whiskey Ambassador for the James B. Beam Distilling Company. So everything that comes out of Beam, and there's a lot, and there will continue to be more really cool things coming in the next 3 to 4 years. A little bit about me. I've been in the spirits industry for the last almost 15 years. I grew up in the spirits industry. My family had restaurants growing up here in Los Angeles, and one of my first love, they were clearly Mexican restaurants, but one of my first loves was bourbon. And kind of looking back through all of my old cocktail recipes when I started getting into the whole scene, I started delving into all the old classic bourbon and rye recipes, and kind of like after ran several bars in LA, including the Spare Room at the Holly Roosevelt, Winsome, lived in Portland for several years, ran a couple of award-winning bars up there, and essentially moved around all over the West Coast. And I've done this I've worked with Beam for the last 4.5 years as their portfolio specialist, covering all the brands in Southern California, but recently transitioned into this new role about 7 or 8 months ago. And I feel really fortunate. I love the brands. As I mentioned, they gave me my start in the industry, and they helped me develop, Knob Creek especially helped me develop my love for bourbon and for all whiskeys in general. It was kind of that gateway into the deep dark hole that the whiskey category can be, from Scotch to Irish to everything else that can be barrel and aged. But of course, we're here back to the original love, which is American whiskey. So I'm happy to represent the James P. Beam Distilling Company and everything that's a part of it. And like Vadim said, over the next couple of months, we'll be kind of exploring a lot of the other things that we have, but we need an entry point and we need somewhere to start. And that's going to be Basil Hayden, which was the beginning of the small batch bourbon portfolio that Booker Noe introduced into the world in 1992. So I'll give you a little bit of background and history. This is really kind of a two-way street. I'm here to answer questions. One of the really cool things, just having spent, I don't know how many of you were on here a couple minutes ago when Vadim and I were talking about me being at the distillery a couple of weeks ago. But one of the really cool things that that's I'm not going to say new, but it's a development in our distillery is that now that our new micro or small batch distillery is open on the Claremont campus, the Fred B. Noe distillery, Freddie Noe, our 8th generation master distiller, has really taken the reins of operations and has really taken it upon himself to be an open book. Freddie is 32 years old, a little bit older than that, but we understand each other and we understand we come from that same cloth where tell us, be open, be transparent as possible, what you're making, what you're doing, and let's talk about it. Let's have an honest conversation about things. Ask all the questions. I'll give you as many answers as possible. And I'm just going to continue that philosophy that Freddie had, which is ask for forgiveness later. You're going to be fine, and be an open book. Be as much as we can. If I don't have the answers to the questions that you might have tonight, I'll make sure to take note, ask Fred or Freddie, and at some point we'll get back to you, and as much as possible. And I'm here for you to answer as many questions as I can about Basil Hayden, about our innovations, about things that are coming in the future, and everything but, sadly, that cask strength Basil Hayden, which we'll get to the reasons why that's a whole thing. But yeah, I'm excited
Fantastic.
to be here.
Quick question for you. So we have
Yes.
6 fantastic Basil Hayden expressions in front of us. Everybody's got 6 little vials. I'm guessing we're going to start with the classic bourbon, but do you want to tell us what order we're going to taste in today so people can line up their glasses appropriately?
Yes, absolutely. So I think we should start. I have all my bottles behind me. I think we should start classic Basil Hayden, then head into the Basil Hayden 10-year to kind of have that comparison contrast. Then go into Basil Hayden Toast, and then we can go into the Basil Hayden Dark Rye and finish with Rye, and at the very end do Subtle Smoke.
That was exactly the order I would have guessed. Perfect. And it's funny, there's sometimes where I guess an order and it's just way off. So you never know.
No. We're on the same page here.
For sure.
And that's always good to see.
We're super excited. I mean, not a bad one in the lineup, right? You start with a classic, you finish with something innovative and new. But I gotta say, I think a lot of people here are super excited to try that Subtle Smoke, because my understanding is it's not even in market yet, right? You told me it's delayed.
It's not in market right now. I just checked our inventory dates from our sales folks, and it's scheduled to drop in California on May 15th. So the bottle that Vadim got a hold of, or that I gave Vadim, is a pre-production. So just a small tangent. We have a space at the distillery called the Global Innovation Center, and at the Global Innovation Center, that's where we produce all of our samples that go out to all the ambassadors for American whiskey, and they are not official sale bottles. They are bottles that have been mocked up to look exactly like production bottles. So this bottle of Subtle Smoke, and the one Vadim has, is the exact same thing that a retail bottle will be like, but all of these are one-off pieces. They're not pieces or labels that were in production at that point. These are all just like one-offs that were made specifically for these samples that went out. And if you look at the label in the back, it'll say sample on the barcode. This is not even a real barcode. It'll just say sample sale, not for resale, and all the barcodes will just be X'd out. Just a fun little fact. Just a fun little thing. But everything else, labeling, everything has been approved by the TTB. It's just a fun little thing that I thought it'd be cool to include. I mean, I don't know. When I taste, I like even numbers. When I do things on my own, I like odd numbers. That's a whole different conversation that we won't get into today. It's just part of my personality, but I'm excited to share these whiskeys with you and to get your opinion on all of them. I think like a lot of us, I wouldn't say I'm jaded, but I'm very used to drinking high proof spirits and talking about high proof spirits. But I'd say that I'll include myself in your group, we are sometimes the exception of the whole category. And most people who end up tasting high proof spirits are like, oh, give me something a little softer, a little smoother, a little easier to drink. And I think that not only in my opinion, but also in the opinion of what Booker Noe thought when he was developing the small batch bourbon collection, Basil Hayden kind of fit that bill of being that intro whiskey, I like to call it handshake whiskey. Sometimes I like to call it sessionable whiskey. It was that introduction into the category as a way to say, welcome to Kentucky, welcome to Claremont, and essentially welcome to the James B. Beam Distilling Company. And so this being the very first tasting that I'm doing with all of you, welcome to the James B. Beam Distilling Company. And the best way to do it is through some Basil Hayden. So the way that I'll kind of go about it is I'll give you like a quick history. I think most of us are very familiar with the James B. Beam Distilling Company. And then just to kind of set a little bit of a background on what we're chatting about and where the name comes from. And then we'll dive straight into tasting, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So I'll get a little geeky, talk about barrel entry proof, talk about yeast strains, talk about mash bills, which is something that we haven't done with James B. Beam in a long time, if at all. So I'm happy to do all those things with you. And yeah, let's get to it. So before I start, actually, you know what? Once we have our first pour, we'll do a little test. But for now, let's chat a little bit about the James B. Beam Distilling Company. So, as you know, we are a company that has over 225 years of history. So, let me get this out of the way here. So I have some room. Get a glass in hand. There's my baby. So we really have to go back to the year 1788, and 1788 is kind of a very important year for us. It's not the year that we just started distilling, but it was the year that Jacob Beam, we consider to be our first generation master distiller. That's when he decided to move his family from Maryland, where his uncle's farm used to be, to Lincoln County, Kentucky, or what is now Lincoln County, Kentucky. So Jacob Beam's family originally came from Germany, the Bohm family, and they settled in Pennsylvania. And like just about everybody who settled in Pennsylvania, they settled down as farmers, and they were distilling mainly rye. And of course, during those times, it was very common for all farmers or all working farms to have, as part of their farming equipment, a working still, big or small. And it was just a way to move through excess grain and keep up with, and really a way to produce extra profit for them. So the Beam family already, like almost all farming families, already had a little bit of that distilling background to them, but it wasn't really their trade. They were really just farmers by trade. So Jacob Beam inherited some land from his uncle in Kentucky as everyone started moving out west. And the interesting part about it is that at that time, he decided to settle in Lincoln, like I said, Lincoln County, Kentucky, before moving to Washington County, Kentucky, where he became friends with a man. And this is really where the name comes from, with a man called Meredith Basil Hayden. And Meredith Basil Hayden was, or is known as a king of high rye, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And that's why I like to keep a bottle of Old Grandad in hand, because it really gives you a little visual. This is one of the old bottles of Old Grandad, and Old Grandad is Meredith Basil Hayden. And we can start chatting sometime later on about the differences between Basil Hayden and Old Grandad. We're going to do a whole other Old Grandad and Old Overhaul tasting at some point in the future, which I'm really excited to do, because it'll be one of the first times that we actually get to chat about those brands fully, top to bottom. But for now, we're going to focus on Meredith Basil Hayden, and Meredith Basil Hayden really took Jim Beam under his wing and mentor him for approximately 2 years in the way of distillation. Of course, the king of high rye already had this supplemental knowledge about distilling rye, and he taught Jacob Beam, I'm sorry, about distilling. And at that time, of course, the cash crop in Kentucky was corn. Rye didn't grow as well, so of course they had to find a new way, and something new that was also just happened to be subsidized by the federal government. So of course, corn became the predominant crop, and what we now know as bourbon became the predominant drink of choice in the southern hemisphere of the United States. So we won't get too technical into detail into the history, because over the course of the next couple of tastings, we'll delve into specific areas of that history. I think the most important things for me to point out are really not necessarily the expansion of the Beam distillery, but really just jump to the 1920s when we ended up purchasing the Murphy and Barber distillery. So as I mentioned, I was in Kentucky a couple of weeks ago, and I was really trying to delve into the history of the Murphy and Barber Distilling Company that became eventually the home of the James B. Beam Distilling Company in Claremont, Kentucky. And one of the really interesting things that I found out is that as far as our understanding and the understanding from Booker Beam, is that the distillery wasn't actually a bourbon distillery. So looking at some of the old pictures, and this is something that we're going to have to research some more, because this is new to me and just something that had never been pointed out. It looked to be that it was a cane, essentially like a rum distilling operation that was stripped down. It just so happened to be in a really beautiful water source, and they apparently they were distilling cane sugar distillate. And during Prohibition, of course, we tore all that down. The Beam family at this point now, Jim Beam, tried his hands at orange farming down in Florida, bought a couple hundred acres of orange orchards, and tried growing oranges. Of course, he failed grandly, because, well, how do you go from growing corn to running an orchard in Florida? And they also happen to have a rock quarry on property. So they had a couple of other businesses that helped them move along, collect some capital during Prohibition. But of course, at the age of in his mid-70s, Jim Beam could have retired. He could have said, you know what, I'm going to throw my hands up, I'm going to give up, I'm going to retire and essentially live the rest of my life out and be comfortable. But of course, he didn't do that. And as legend goes, and of course, as history shows, we were able to rebuild our distillery in about 120 days in 1934. And by 1935, we were laying down our first set of barrels. And of course, the rest is history. We started continuing expanding and growing. And by the early 40s, Jim Beam White had become the #1 whiskey in the world. And this was in no small part due to the effort that the Beams had, and also just supporting the war effort. We became the bourbon of choice for a lot of our soldiers fighting in World War II and World War I, and I mean World War II. I'm sorry, and it just became something that they brought back, and that nostalgia, that memory, led us to become one of the top whiskey producers in the world. And this is really where the legacy that Booker No kind of fell into. Booker, of course, was the son of Jim Beam's sister, who married into the No family. So, of course, there weren't any sons to take over, and so, of course, the next generation just happened to fall upon Jim Beam's sister and on the No family. So Booker No ends up taking over the distillery in the late 60s. First, he was operations manager for the Boston plant, where we now distill most of our Jim Beam Black and most of our Jim Beam White, and eventually became the distiller for both the Claremont facility and our Boston plant. And he was really in this landscape where people were producing pretty boring whiskey. Most of the whiskey at that time, if we start looking at that landscape and the history, was sitting at around 2 to 4 years and was sitting anywhere between 80 to 100 proof. There was a couple of bonded whiskeys, but most, as you know, most of the whiskeys were sitting at a very comfortable 80 proof, and everybody was happy with that 80 proof. And he kind of took a step back and said, well, I want to make whiskey the way I want to make it. Let's continue innovating in the same way that my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather kind of took their brands and weren't afraid to push the envelope forward. Because as we know, Jim Beam hadn't always been that established brand. There had been other brands that had existed before that had really led the pack in the competition. Things like Old Tub, which gave the name of one of our old distilleries, the Old Tub Distillery, which is really the David M. and Sons Distilling Company, which that'll be it. Again, there's so much history, you can literally spend hours talking about it, but we're kind of getting the snippets that lead us into tasting Basil Hayden. So in 1988, most important thing happened, which was that Booker No decided to release his the very first piece of that small batch bourbon collection, which was Booker's. And of course, Booker's is an iconic whiskey, uncut, unfiltered, cask strength whiskey, which we all know and we all love, depending on the batch. I know I have my favorite batches from 2021. I know that all of you have your favorite batches from 2021, and that's kind of the beauty of it all. There's so much flavor variation. There's so many things that we can do with it. But he took a step back, and the very first release was, let me think about the way that I like to drink whiskey. And that was his preferred method of drinking whiskey. But then he took another step back and he started asking himself, well, okay, what can I do to create variety across the category? Jim Beam is already well established on its way, and Jim Beam Black is already well established and on their way to becoming top selling whiskeys, if not already there. Let me come up with something new and innovative that showcases the quality that our distillery can create. So him and Baker set kind of really their minds to work. Baker really handled mainly most of the operations, day-to-day operations, warehousing, the distillery bottling lines, et cetera, to really give Booker that opportunity to take a step back and focus on innovating. And 88, 9, 90, and 1, I think 4 years later, the small batch bourbon collection launched. And of course, we were one of the first people to ever coin that term, if not the very first company to coin the term small batch bourbon. And in that collection, of course, Basil Hayden, Knob Creek, Booker's, and Baker's existed, or Baker's and Booker's existed. And each one of them serves a purpose. As I mentioned at the very, very beginning, Basil Hayden, the whole point, the whole idea behind Basil Hayden was to be that sessionable whiskey, that introduction, that handshake into Claremont, in a time where whiskey had started falling out of favor. And of course, as we know, vodka skyrocketed to become the #1 spirit, the consumed spirit in the United States and the world. So this is really a way to say, hey, check out what we're producing. We can produce other things besides our classic mash bill, which we'll get into, and try something new. And from that point forward, it's kind of been that vehicle for us to introduce new concepts, new ideas, new flavor profiles into the category of bourbon. As you'll see through the lineup, sometimes people like to ask me, oh, okay, so your lineup makes sense up to a certain point, and then it doesn't make sense, and then it makes sense again. What's going on with Basil Hayden? I get a lot of that question a lot from consumers, maybe not so much from us whiskey drinkers in general, but it all had a point and it all had a purpose. And really that purpose was to innovate and introduce, like, as I mentioned, new ideas into the category. So without further ado, let's taste our very first pour, which is classic Basil Hayden. Does anyone have any questions so far?
I think it was a great introduction. I do have a question about the design. The iconic Basil Hayden has been redesigned?
Yes.
Okay. Because I was looking at the background from David had, and I was like, wait, I remember Basil Hayden looking like that, and now it looks a little different. I like it. It's a little more modern.
Yeah. So there, I just happen to have one bottle of each. This happened to be the a collaboration that we did with a company called oh my God, why am I blanking on the name? Now I'm lost. But it's a travel and leisure company that produces guides for each city. Sam something, and I don't know why the name escapes me. But the whole purpose behind this original bottle was to really showcase the barrel aging, and the bib was very similar to the bib that people that your distillers and assistant distillers would wear, people around the factory would wear as they were working on the line. And it was just kind of a fun way to showcase, like that the craft, the effort, the time that really goes into production even now. And as we kind of moved and modernized in the world, the bottles were becoming problematic as we kind of moved towards this renewed effort for conservation. We had to take a step back and say, hey, there's a lot of waste going into these bottles. They're really cool and they're really nice. The wood's really nice. The bibs are really nice. But we were getting a lot of bottles sent back. They also all happen to be wrapped in plastic before they got shipped. So there was a plastic layer, and then there was extra padding around the boxes to protect this bib. And then there was the box itself, which had to be produced at a thicker weight to accommodate all these bottles that were very delicate and tended to rip right around the edges here, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with. As a bartender, I remember, and I'll be honest with you, I remember hating these bottles for cocktails behind the bar, because every time that I would grab one in the well, I would pull it up and I would tear, something would tear at some point. It would catch on something. My bartenders would sometimes drop the bottles and break them. It was overall a pain. So when we decided to kind of like move into this new bottling, we try to honor that same legacy by keeping the really nice, beautiful band that's reminiscent of the bands around like a barrel, like a classic bourbon barrel, and keep our iconic Basil Hayden logo while still introducing a little bit more detail on the side about what's actually in your bottle. So I think it's nice. I think it highlights, it's a nice way to modernize. I do miss the old bottling simply for nostalgia's sake, but I think overall it's a more modern, newer representation of our brand. And of course, we're never kind of afraid to move forward and innovate. So I think it's pretty par for the course for everything we do at Beam, which is not be afraid of moving forward, but at the same time, kind of try our best to honor that legacy of the generations that came before us. So let's taste some Beam, let's taste some Basil Hayden. I really like how it opens up. It's got a really like nice, easy, accessible nose. You get a lot of those. I feel like Basil Hayden, more than just about everything that we distill, has like this very iconic floral nose. And really one of the interesting things about Basil Hayden is that throughout the whole small batch bourbon portfolio, we share very similar mash bills. So if you look at the mash bills for Jim Beam, Knob Creek, Booker's, and Baker's, they're essentially, if not the same mash bill. You're thinking about that really high 75 to 78% corn, that high teens 10 to 13% rye, and that single digit malted barley to kind of help that fermentation process along. When we started thinking about Basil Hayden, we started thinking about all the other classic pre-prohibition formulas, what we learned from Meredith Basil Hayden, and we took a little inspiration from what Old Grandad was, which was what we like to call a high rye bourbon. So this high rye bourbon is approximately somewhere in the high 60s corn, high 20s, 20 to 25% rye, and the rest of it comes from, and the rest of the mash bill is made up of malted barley. Now, of course, just like everything else, that formula slightly changes from time to time. Like talking to Freddie's all like, you know what, yeah, I could give you a specific number for most of the things that we met for almost everything, but I'd be doing a disservice to myself and to my family, because things do change. Those percentages will be slightly adjusted to make sure if like certain batches of grain aren't coming in right, we're gonna switch it up just a tiny little bit. So I can never just give you one number. So I can give you approximate percentages, but the mash bill is not the point for us, at least at James B. Beam. It's everything else that happens along the process. So let's take a nose. Let's smell. Let's give it that first taste. Have y'all ever seen Booker or remember Booker or Fred doing the Kentucky Chew? Yeah, that
Not everyone. Show
not
us.
everyone. So it was always taught to me like this. Take a look at it. Look at the beautiful legs. Look at the beautiful color on that whiskey. Take in the aroma. Make sure to park your lips and inhale through both your lips and your nose, since we have all these olfactory senses on both our palate, throughout our mouth, and in our nose, in our sinuses. And then take a small sip and use it as mouthwash. Just numb your palate. Next, take another sip, let it roll down your tongue, and pretend you have a piece of cotton or toffee in your mouth. And pretend you're trying really hard to chew it out. And of course, that's what that's going to do, is it's going to help aerate the whiskey, introduce oxygen into it, and release all those beautiful flavors and aromas. And of course, what ends up happening for me is that's when I start tasting all those beautiful, like nutty, kind of like roasted peanuts. I like to call them peanut shells, like salted peanut. I love salted peanuts. So that's the first place my memory goes to. Some other people say cashews. I will stick with that very classic, iconic salted peanut flavor that I get in my mouth. So kind of going back to that whole idea, we're all starting, everything at the company, of course, is at the James Beam Distilling Company, starting off with that iconic water source. So we're pulling all of our water from the Bernheim Forest, which is literally right across the road from Claremont. How many of you have been out to Claremont and seen our distillery? A couple of you? Okay. So yeah, we were literally on the border of a nature preserve, and the nature preserve, we have a really close alliance to them, and we work closely to help preserve those watersheds. And we also work really hard on conserving that beautiful landscape that surrounds us. Most of the land around Beam is protected land that we can't touch, so we can't expand on that territory. So there's this constant source of looking for new land to put up new rick houses. So that's why we have a couple of different sources for our rick houses, but there's nothing that we can do on that land. And of course that helps us. It helps maintain that beautiful clean water source, and it helps continue on the process of creating all the whiskeys that we produce at the distillery. So really the next big thing that I like to chat about is our yeast strain. So one of the really interesting things about the way that we've kind of gone about our process is that so we have two unique yeast strains. When we get to our conversation on Old Granite and Old Overholt, we'll chat about the other yeast strain, but for now we'll chat about the James B. Beam Distilling Company yeast strain. And the James B. Beam Distilling Company yeast strain has existed since the James B. Beam Distilling Company opened in 1933 into 1934. The old yeast strain that we used at the David and Sons Distilling Company is long gone, but when Jim Beam started the James B. Beam Distilling Company, he kind of used that as an opportunity to kind of soft reset everything. And of course, that old yeast strain was lost, and he took it upon himself to propagate a brand new yeast strain, a brand new wild yeast strain. And this is something that, chatting with Fred and Freddie, I didn't really have an understanding of how important it was to us and how much that yeast strain meant to them, to the point where I feel like it's something that we'll start chatting about more. But up to this point, it's not something that I was even aware of, how much effort is put into replicating this yeast strain and not introducing any external variables into our yeast. So now, when we talk about yeast, everybody likes to talk about having their own jug yeast, but that jug yeast has really and truly been there, and we've invested I'm going to say millions of dollars into making sure that yeast strain continues to live on in that same way and continues to be propagated in the same way, to the point where the new James P. Beam Distilling Company has its own facility and lab to keep and continue reproducing that yeast strain without introducing too much stress into it. And all we're doing is an experiment in scaling. So we feed it the same thing that we fed it ever since the 1940s, which is a combination of hops and of barley and hops, mainly hops, just to continue having it grow. So once it's introduced into the batch, it kind of takes a little bit of shock. So it takes a couple of hours and a couple of days to really like help move its way along. A lot of it dies off, and then of course it continues to propagate. And it's now dispersed not only between our facility in Claremont, but the Fred Bino Distillery and also the Boston plant. So now it lives in 3 places, but the main source of yeast will now be the Fred Bino Distillery. We had another small yeast facility in Claremont, but given Freddie's their understanding about it and how much they appreciated, it's one of those things that we will continue chatting about, and it's one of those things that gives us that iconic mouthfeel, that it gives us that iconic like nuttiness, and for me, a lot of that citrus, and a lot of those really heavy vanilla and caramel notes that we find in all of our bourbons. And of course, Basil Hayden's going to be slightly different. Of course, we already chatted about that mash bill. I kind of needed to get that out of the way, because I think it's really important for us to understand that it's not that same mash bill that goes into everything else. But what's going to continue that, what's going to give the through line through the whole small batch bourbon collection is going to be that iconic yeast strain that comes from James P. Beam. This is the first bourbon I've tried. It's the first bourbon.
I had a question going back just to begin talking about this being sort of a handshake bourbon, introductory bourbon.
Yeah.
I don't associate that with high rye bourbon. Just me personally, if I'm having someone who hasn't had it, a lot of bourbon or whiskey, I don't reach for a high rye as like the first pour. I might do some, I understand the 80% totally. And I do, I think Basil Hayden actually stands up to 80% well, but, wondering the thought process of having high rye in what you're calling a handshake, just because that seems incongruous to me. So I'm just wondering the thought process.
Sure. I think that's just, that's just the way that I feel about it. I'm not going to say that that's the way that Fred or Freddie thinks about it, but for me, whenever I was introduced to Basil Hayden, the way that I felt about it was that it was for me that, oh, hey, welcome to exploring the world of whiskey. You're right. I think that high rye mash bill is an interesting way to approach a situation, but of course we have our iconic Jim Beam White and Jim Beam Black. So if we just use that same mash bill and put it in a bottle and called it Basil Hayden, I think, of course, it'd be doing a disservice to the whole category itself. So I think in kind of really thinking about that legacy and history of the distillery and of what Booker wanted out of it, it was his way to introduce the world to the concept of high rye in a time where everybody was used to drinking that super corn heavy 2 to 4 year or bonded bourbon.
Gotcha. So more like an introduction to the exploration of the possibilities of bourbon rather than bourbon. Totally makes sense. Sorry, I just
no. I think that's a great question, and of course that in the future is going to help me express that idea a little bit better, because I think that that's a very, very nuanced and important key point to bring up. Because you're right, it isn't something that you'd say, oh, like this is iconic whiskey. This is what bourbon tastes like. This is more of like, let's delve into other like the category itself.
Gotcha. Oh,
I was right there with you, Jordan.
But hearing it that way, that makes a lot of sense. It's sort of like, not here it is for the first time, but let me show you what else this can be. Because that also makes a lot of sense, I think, with what the rest of the, because we're going to go a lot of different places with the tasting. So I like that as sort of an introduction to where we can go with whiskey.
Right.
Does Basil Hayden release a high wheat, or is everything high rye?
What was that?
Does Basil Hayden have a high wheat release, like a wheated bourbon release?
We don't have a wheated release. I'll get into Basil Hayden toast, and then we'll chat about different mash bills. But we haven't introduced any high wheat.
Oh.
Yeah. I'll never say never, because it's kind of one of the fun things about Basil Hayden we like to explore. And that's one of the things that you'll see when I start chatting about Basil Hayden toast. It's kind of cool and funky and exciting. Yeah, again, another way to continue exploring that category. But thank you, Jordan. Like that it helps me as I start chatting more about the brands and really understanding like how people see them and perceive them. And I think that's like, you just had that little light bulb moment for me where I'm like, oh, okay, perfect. Like that's exactly what you said is how I need to communicate that message. So thanks.
Hey, if you're looking for someone to drink with and talk to, I mean, I'll volunteer anytime. I'm here.
Hey, I'm in. So I guess let's move right along and taste that Basil Hayden 10-year.
It's really, I get a lot of the rye in the classic with a little of the honey, but the 10-year, I get the wood influence a lot more, and then the honey right behind it, and the rye not as much. It's really interesting how the extra time influences it in a really lovely way.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's one of the really interesting things about Basil Hayden in general. So I think the classic has, I'm not going to say like, it's got very nuanced flavors and aromas. And even though it doesn't have an age statement and it's never had an age statement, if you go to Claremont and go to the actual, like, go through the whole tour thing, and you look at the wall that says Basil Hayden, it'll say 6 year, at least 6 years at the very bottom. And that's 100% true. Like all the bottles, all the barrels that are being dumped for Basil Hayden are 6+, at the very least 6 years. And so those extra 4 years are going to have a huge impact on the whiskey, especially once it's brought down to 80 proof. I think you're going to bring out a lot more of those like beautiful, like oaky, charred, leathery tobacco notes. Maybe not to the same extent that you would get from a bonded or a cask strength or higher proof whiskey, but it's again that introduction into the idea of higher age statement whiskey. And I think when I think age statement whiskey, I start thinking about cask strength and I start thinking about higher proof offerings or single barrel offerings. But I think for somebody who's just coming into the category and is starting to explore like higher age statements, a 10-year like Basil Hayden, like a high rye 10-year, especially with Basil Hayden, is like really helps open those gateways. Like I get a lot more peanut and vanilla notes and citrusy floral notes in the classic Basil Hayden, but when I smell this, I get so much more stone fruit, and it opens up a lot more into all, like I said, all these like really like pruny, raisiny, earthy notes. I don't know what everybody else gets, but somebody's already on the dark rye. I think I need to drink a little faster than you guys. What did we think for 10-year versus classic? Does anyone have a favorite? Like I said, I feel like they're vastly different. Those extra 4 years like really do crazy things to bourbon. Did anyone have a favorite between the two of them? Since they both have the same mash bill, proof, yeast strain, water source, everything else.
I actually prefer the original, the classic. And I find that to be, for my palate, kind of an ongoing theme, where the 10-year-old Mark bourbon tends to be a little over oaked for my palate.
One of the, yeah, I tend to agree with you. I appreciate the 10-year for what it is, and I think it makes a delicious cocktail. If I was to drink something over ice or neat on its own, I think I would always go classic over the 10-year. It just, like I said, it just fits my palate a little bit better, and I understand where it kind of fits into the category. One of the really interesting things about Basil Hayden is also the entry proof, barrel entry proof, and I think that's one of the new things that we're also being a little bit more transparent about. And just about everything of James B. Beam Distilling Company has a different barrel entry proof. So if we're thinking about Jim Beam, of course, like by law, things can barrel entry proof has to be, what is it, 125? I'm sorry, it could be distilled at 160 and then barreled at 135, 125. Why am I blanking out on this information? It'll come to me. Regardless, So when we're thinking about what the barrel entry proof for Jim Beam is, we're looking at 132 to 133 barrel entry proof. When we're looking at Knob Creek, which we'll taste another time, that's going in a solid 130. 125 for Bakers and Bookers, and then Basil Hayden has the lowest entry proof, which is 117, 115 or 117. I've gotten a few different numbers from the distillers, from the assistant distillers, but I think last time I was there, they told me 115. The time previous, I got 117. But I've had enough mentions of those numbers to know that it's somewhere between 115 and 117. And of course, it goes into the bottle at 80 proof, which of course creates just like a softer, more nuanced, subtler whiskey, as opposed to that Knob Creek, which really needs to be a little bit more punchy. And of course, the proof of the Bookers and Bakers, which needs to stand up a little bit more, have a little bit more like depth to it. Yeah, exactly. Super soft and easy to drink. Yeah. So let's see, what's next, everyone? Basil Hayden toast. Oh, this is going to be a fun one to talk about. Where did my Basil Hayden toast go? Okay, fun fact, I don't remember where my Basil Hayden toast bottle is, but I happen to have one of the pre-production PET PET bottles that was sent to me when it was still in its original liquid stage form. So if you ever catch me around, the Demon friends, just I'll probably be carrying this around. I think I have this bottle and like one other bottle. They ship so much to me. So if you ever want to taste it in its original form before it was actually bottled, hit me up and I'm always happy to pour you a little bit. That's kind of the fun part about the job. You get all these bottles that get sent to you and you're like, oh, this is going to be cool. I don't know what it's going to look like or be, but let's give it a whirl. Let's have some fun with it. So Basil Hayden toast is really the brainchild of Freddie, and it's one of the first projects that Fred and Freddie worked on together. And the whole idea behind it was, how do we make a whiskey that continues honoring that legacy that Booker set down, but continues to innovate forward and creates a bigger, bolder flavor. I know that have you guys ever had a Maker's Mark tasting before? I know that they love to use a term with 46. Let's create a bigger, bolder 46. And I hate to use the same terminology, but how do we create a bigger, bolder Basil Hayden? So next time I see Phil, I always joke with Phil Olson, who's our local Maker's Mark diplomat, about this. Like, hey, Basil Hayden toast is bigger, bolder Basil Hayden. He doesn't like it, but it's okay. We like to give each other a hard time.
You guys definitely have a fun family of brands.
We do. And it happens to be nice that we all just so happen to be lucky enough to get along with each other. So Basil Hayden toast kind of turns the formula of high rye whiskey on its head, and it introduces a new mash bill. It's kind of that introduction into new mash bills. So what we're doing is that instead we're essentially taking that same high rye bourbon, and rather than introducing that 20 to 23% rye, we're taking the rye out completely and introducing American brown rice. So you've got that high 60% corn, you don't have any rye, you have American brown rice, and you have malted barley at the very end. And I know that Jim Beam has had other experiments in malted barley, in toasted rice, but this specific distillate that's in this bottle is one of the first things that Freddie started working on. So when he first started taking over operations at the distillery, he kind of went out to visit a lot of like farmers in other states and learn about the growing practices and sustainability. And he became really close friends with some farmers out in Arkansas. And he decided to partner up with them for one of the very first Basil Hayden innovations that he was in charge of, and ended up sourcing a strain of American brown rice off the top, I do not remember. I can always get that information for you. But the idea was to really bring out those sweeter components while reducing the amount of tannins that were as a result of barreling, and really take the iconic flavors of Basil Hayden, those soft, floral, beautiful notes, and increase the finish a little bit more, and also increase that mid palate and expand it. So Basil Hayden already has this like very soft, delicate flavor, but with Basil Hayden toast, you kind of take that idea and grow with it. So what we do is that we season our steaks for 18 months, and then we take this mash bill, and on top of it, I'm getting myself a little sidetracked. So we create this distillate, we lay it down for 5 years, and then we finish it in new American oak barrels that have been seasoned for an additional 18 months. So it's Basil Hayden toast, not only from the toasted rice mash bill, but also from a toasted barreling finish. So we're starting off with that classic level 4 char for our barrels, and then we're finishing the whiskey for an additional 6 to 9 months, I'm going to say, in toasted barrels. I'm sure everyone's familiar with how barrels are charred. I think that our barrels char in about 17 to 23 seconds, I believe. These toasted barrels toast at a lower temperature, and they take anywhere from what I saw, and I timed, it takes about 40, I timed some at 40 and I timed some at 45 seconds. So 40 to 45 seconds for these barrels to char. We try to char them to about a level 2 char rather than a level 4 char, which is our iconic char for just about everything else. So again, it can get a little complicated. This is a new American, a new mash bill that's corn, toasted American brown rice, and malted barley, aged for 5 years, and then finished in seasoned and toasted barrels. So interesting, but it also takes that same kind of iconic, like very floral nose, and kind of grows and expands that a lot more. The only other times that we've used brown rice have been for our experimental things. I think the only other time that I remember from looking back through our history is in 2014 with the Jim Beam signature. That was just 100% American brown rice. And then in Little Book Chapter 5, we were using a vintage American brown rice distillate that we had at Beam. But again, as I mentioned, this is a brand new American rice mash bill that's used specifically for Basil Hayden toast.
I over the holidays used this to make a homemade bourbon cream, and it was ridiculous. It was like, I had it in coffee, I had it on vanilla ice cream, I had it just itself, I had it with root beer. It was so good. The sweet notes, the vanilla notes, the brown butter notes Jane was talking about just went so well as a bourbon cream. It was outrageous.
Jane, I love that description of that brown butter with a little bit of sweetness on the back end. That's like, I think one of the perfect descriptions of what it would be. I love using that brown butter, and I was getting into it, but you beat me to it. And I think that's like, you hit the nail on the head of what you get out of it.
Wait till you get
Jordan,
to that dark rye.
What was that?
Say, wait till you get to that dark
Wait till,
rye.
yeah, exactly.
Oh my God, talk about the vanilla and the butter.
Right. Jordan, what did you use for, you said you made a bourbon cream. Was it like a heavy cream base, or was it
So yeah, so the base was, so my wife's lactose intolerant, and so is her family. So the base was lactose free, half and half, because there is no lactose free heavy cream. It's like coconut cream, and I didn't want to mess with that. So
right?
Lactose free, half and half, you get at Sprouts. So that was the base, and it was delicious.
Oh, that sounds great. Yeah, at some point we need to get a dram, and like I need to exchange some ideas here. I'm in. All right, folks, what time is it? 7, 8. All right, let's get to let's bring some dark rye and start exploring that category a little bit. One of those mysterious things that that came out as one of the first, the very first innovation that that Basil Hayden produced. Where's my dark red? There it is. So, of course, as I will continue to reiterate as we kind of taste through everything, this is kind of an exploration into blended whiskeys. So, I think there was a little confusion when it first came out, and I know that when I was behind the bar when this came out, I was a little confused about where this kind of fit into the spectrum of James V. Beam and of Basil Hayden, and what it actually was. Like, I didn't know if it was barrel finished, if it was liquid finished, but I'll be the first to tell you that this is a liquid finished, not a barrel finished rye. So you've got a little bit of port wine that's bringing down the proof a little bit. Of course, we're still using that Kentucky limestone water to help bring it down, but there is port introduced into this to help bring it down. And I don't think that that's something that we explicitly say, but of course we're nerding out on things, right? So I'm going to be as honest as possible and say that that's exactly what's happening in this. And that was the same thing that happened with the Caribbean. Did anyone ever have that Caribbean cask? So the Caribbean cask was finished with blackstrap molasses rum, and it was still, some people loved it, some people hated it. I was in the category that I really enjoyed it more than the dark rye. I love the dark rye. I think it brings out so much, Damon mentioned, it brought out so much more of those like vanilla, brown butter, like caramel notes out of it. And I think this is really like an iconic example of exploring categories and exploring what whiskey can be. So to kind of offset a little bit of the of that sweetness that came from that port wine, we used Kentucky straight rye, and we also blended it with Canadian rye, 100% Canadian rye. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the whole Beam Suntory category in general, but we own Alberta Distillery in Canada, which recently won an award for, I believe, one of the best whiskeys in the world. I never got a chance to get a sample bottle, and I'm really upset about it. But yeah, so this is Canadian whiskey from Alberta Distilling Company, Kentucky straight rye whiskey, and a little bit of port wine. So it's those two things. You could start seeing that DNA into this idea of blending kind of start coming into light. I know we see it now with things like Legend and things like Little Book throughout the chapters, and Freddie has really embraced it as his thing that he likes to do. Like, let's get rid of that. He likes to say, let's break the stereotype on the B word. Because for a long time, of course, the B word, blending, was kind of a sign of inferior quality in the world of bourbon. And we were all focused on single barrels and cask strength and uncut, unfiltered, and really didn't honor the legacy of what distillers around the world, from Ireland to Scotland, have been doing for decades, if not centuries. So this is kind of a way for us, like, you can start seeing that this is where their minds were at when they were working on this innovation. And innovations, I'll get a little geeky about with you guys. Innovations is a really interesting category, and it's one of those things that was fascinating that I knew very little about when visiting the James Beam Distilling Company. Even this time, like, it's not something that's explicitly that anybody really is allowed into. It's more of like a think tank, and it's a place for us to like really play around and explore with flavors and the way that it works is they have hundreds of samples of different casks and experiments that they've been working on for the last like decade or two. So a ton of vintage liquid in one giant laboratory where literally you can just pull a bottle and say, I'm looking for a whiskey that has this flavor profile, and they'll pull you a bottle and they'll say, cool, this bourbon or this rye from XYZ year had these flavor characteristics, and this one had these flavor characteristics. What if we pull these two together to create this flavor profile, or this flavor profile is this very smoky, earthy, whatever, I'm just making this up, flavor profile is really trending. What do we have in our library of liquids that can fit this flavor profile? Just like one of the most fascinating things, it's that meeting between science and art. And of course, Freddie's involved in this whole process, but Freddie more than Fred now is involved in the science of it, really understanding the process of the science. So one of the this kind of delving into the next conversation that I wanted to have with you guys, which is the things that are coming out of the Fred Bino distillery. Kind of moving forward, we'll chat about like Bookers and Bakers like some other time, but a lot of really cool things are happening at the distillery. So up to this point, a lot of the assistant distillers, a lot of the production managers, a lot of like the people who were working at the distillery understood the art of distillation, understood the nuances that go in, how to finagle the system, but didn't really understand the science behind it. So Freddie, is taking it upon himself to instruct all these old timers, all these people who have been working at the distillery for the past 20, 25, 30 years, to really understand the science behind it all as well. And his whole ideal behind it is let's use this as an opportunity to troubleshoot anything that happens, because the minute production goes down or the minute something happens at the distillery, instead of calling somebody to fix it, you're empowered. You have the power now to fix it yourself and save yourself time, save yourself the headache of not understanding what's happening. So one of the really cool things is that everybody at the distillery who works in any sort of distillation, blending, whatever, is getting sent to the University of Kentucky to really expand their knowledge and to really understand the science and nuance behind it all, and to really understand what's happening in the barrels, what's happening in the fermentation tanks, not just understanding what the end result's going to be, but understanding the process that's happening from beginning to end. And I think that's amazing, because you see all these people, like their faces light up when they finally understand, like, oh, I understand that how the flavor changes when the temperature changes in fermentation. I understand that that's a thing, not just understanding that, oh, the flavor is off, and not really understanding what the reasoning behind that is. So again, this leads back to innovation, because it allows them to think about, oh, if we change the entry proof, if we change like if this barreling and these barrelings go together, we might be able to create a bourbon or a rye that has this flavor profile. The possibilities are endless, and it just allows more people to have a part and a say in the whole process beyond just Fred and Freddie. And I like to think that dark rye is one of the first innovations that we came out with, was one of those gateways into that whole idea.
Dark rye is so interesting and so different. When I was pouring it, I noticed just how dark it was.
Mhm.
And so I was ready to be like, well, is it colored? Is it what's? But the fact that you blend it with port explains the color.
Yep.
And what is this categorized as? Is it still whiskey, or is there some kind of loophole in American whiskey labeling laws that allows? Because obviously you can't add anything to bourbon and still call it bourbon, but
Right.
what's the deal with this?
So the way that we've kind of labeled this is, so we have to be by law transparent about it. So, like it's essentially finished whiskey. The label says Kentucky straight rye with Canadian rye, blended with Canadian rye and port. So it's all in the label.
Oh wow!
But of course it's not. It wouldn't be considered a traditional like rye or bourbon whiskey.
Yeah, I think I saw it. It was classified under whiskey specialties.
Yes, that's the exact term that I was looking for. Like whiskey specialties is what it's categorized under. Yeah, same thing goes for the Caribbean cask, and those were really the only two that were ever categorized as whiskey specialties. Nothing else from Basil Hayden has ever been. And this is when we were kind of in our finishing kick, when we were exploring like liquid finishes.
Liquid finishes meaning adding stuff in that's something else.
Correct. Yeah, adding exactly. Yeah, adding something into it.
How much of it is the non-whiskey part?
Give me 1 second. I think I have this information on hand. If I remember correctly, I can always send that out later. But if I remember correctly, it's a small percentage. It's like 5 to 7%, if I remember correctly.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, but you can see the impact that has on the end product, right?
Once I tasted it, I could taste the port, and now I can't get out of my head. This is so good. I'm gonna start pouring port into other things. I love a good port finish, right?
Right.
And this is
I almost wanted to lick the glass.
right.
Yeah.
I think we all love a good port finish, and it's almost got the sourness of a good like port. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Oh, you found the TTB. Where is it?
And I've heard of people like doing that with sherry as well. So that's a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but dude, by comparison, like they released some scientific paper a couple of years ago that said when you do a barrel finish, you normally get around 1 to 2% of the spirit that it's finished in. So if they're doing 5 to 7, you're really, it's like finishing this thing 3 times.
Yeah, because there's no way that you would be able to get this amount of
That'd be a really wet
characteristics in that barrel finish. Impossible.
Yeah, Jason, I was just gonna say, I was like, man, how wet was that barrel to be able to get those kind of flavors, right?
Yeah, again, one of those things that we've never really been very like vocal and open about, but as we kind of move into this new generation of distillers and operators, like it's one of those, and ambassadors in general, I think it's one of those things that's really important for us to have conversation about, and like really understand like what our thought process was, what we wanted to get out of this, because that's the stuff that I like to geek out on. Like, what were you guys thinking? And like, what was the whole the chain that kind of led into the thing that you're coming up with? Because I know there's more than just Fred and Freddie saying this will be cool. There's a bunch of other people involved in the whole process. So I think it's like truly fascinating to me. Which kind of leads me into the rye. Something that I think is extremely interesting from a category point of view. Y'all have the 10-year rye. So here's the fun part about the 10-year rye. I don't have the 10-year rye because availability and issues, but I'm gonna drink this. I'll tell you a quick story. One night I was coming home after a long night of being out in LA with other ambassadors, and I decided to crack a bottle open. And I thought it was one of the 10-year rye bottles. In the morning, I opened the bottle. I looked at my liquor cabinet of like open bottles, and I realized that I had opened up my only bottle of a 2017 release rye from Basil Hayden, which I don't know how many more bottles there are of this floating around, but it's open now. And so this was, I'm going to save as much of this as possible, but this is a rye that's been rebarreled in quarter casks. And this is I've never seen another bottle of this floating around. So I'm sorry that I can't share it with all of you, but if you ever see this rye finished in quarter casks, I think it's kind of a fun little thing to hunt for. I'm sure there's some Dusties floating around somewhere. But the 10-year rye, I think, really harkens back to our legacy of who we are at James B. Beam, and to our heritage back to Pennsylvania, and really our heritage as rye growers. And as we kind of move into innovations in the future, I think I was telling Vadim, like one of the things that we're distilling currently at our distillery is a 100% rye, malted rye mash bill at the Fred Bino distillery. So when I was out there, I was lucky enough to be able to taste day number 3 of a new run of 100% malted rye. I don't know what it's going to go into. Freddie doesn't know what it's going to go into. And it's a very small run. It was an experiment that he was working on. but it's really cool seeing that there is all this innovation on a smaller scale. I know that, one of the really interesting things that I learned was that when we run things through our hardest working still in America, our classic still in Claremont, we have to stop production for about 30 minutes, flush everything out, put in the new mash fill, make a run, and then do it again. And typically that only happens about once or twice a month. Most of the time things are getting produced constantly, and we'll do like 3 to 4 day runs when we're producing like rye whiskey, or when we're producing something like whatever else we're producing. But now that we have access to all these other facilities that can easily be flushed in a couple of minutes rather than a couple of hours and stop production, we have access to be able to distill and create all these really cool innovations and really expand the breadth and the variety that we can produce from James B. Beam. So again, I think the 10-year rye, first of all, I like my ryes a little young, but I think a 10-year rye just like ends up having so much like character and nuance, and you get rid of a little bit of that like spice on the back note, and you get into a lot more of like those really interesting, like bright kind of citrusy, earthy notes on the back. I don't know what y'all get from that 10-year rye, but that's just my opinion, and that's just a little insight into what's going on in the future of the Fred Vino distillery. And again, outside of something like an overhold, I don't see a lot of 100%, a lot of rye whiskey at 80 proof. I tend to think about rye whiskey, and I my brain immediately goes to bottle and bond, right? So again, another way to introduce the category of rye whiskey and age statements to that general public, and to the people who are just getting into the same level of appreciation that we have for the category, but might not be so familiar with exploring higher proofs.
This is really interesting. Maybe because I'm drinking it right after the port, but it's on the sweeter side for me, which I'm enjoying. But it's quite tasty, and yeah, it's a nice break. You know, as much as people talk smack, it's a nice break to drink 40%ers. It's just relaxing. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to worry about it burning me.
Right. Yeah, for kind of our flavor palette that we've developed, and our what's the word I'm looking for our tolerance to higher proof whiskeys. I think it's nice to sometimes go through that 80 proof and say, cool, I'm enjoying it. Let's have a conversation about whiskey in general, and let's have a good time. It kind of harkens back to what Fred and Booker used to say, which is like, drink bourbon any damn way you please. You drink it however you want. You drink whatever you want in any way you want it. Just enjoy it. You're here to have fun. We were breaking down other whiskeys that are coming up in the future, and we're tasting through profiles, and we're trying to like say what flavors we're getting out of it. And all some ambassadors are sitting at a table with Fred and Freddie, and we're like, oh, we're getting notes of like green apple, and we're getting notes of like leather and tobacco, and we're kind of all geeking out and, you know, like having our moment there with each other. And Fred looks at all of us, and he like interrupts us and says, I didn't use any damn apples in my whiskey. Just as a way to break up the whole, you know, like the seriousness of the whole situation. And we're like, we all stare at each other like, oh, okay, I guess we are all getting a little lost in our own brains about it. Let's just take a step back and enjoy it, and like appreciate the fact that we all get to be in this space together. And this was after like 2 hours of meetings and 2 hours of like tasting and going through things. So I think that's one of the things that I love. Like they take themselves so lightheartedly, and you can't we take our whiskey seriously sometimes, but there's also moments for us to just like take a step back and enjoy it for what it is, right?
And I think a lot of it, or at least now that I learn more about Basil Hayden, knowing who it comes from and the reasoning behind it makes me appreciate it more than, you know what I mean? It's not, in the world of whiskey, there's a lot of brands that will put out a 40% whiskey just to not cut corners, but to maximize profits. This one, you can tell that, you know, it's the same guy who puts out a cast strength Booker's, right? Like, it's not like he doesn't put out cast strength whiskey, or, you know, he knows what he's doing. He knows what he's going for at the 40%. It's not just a matter of like, okay, how can I put out the most amount of bottles and collect the most amount of money for it?
Right, and I think that's one of the most interesting things, and I think that's one of the things that Freddie is very aware of, especially when it came to Little Book. He wanted to kind of honor that same legacy of uncut, unfiltered cast strength. But like, one of the fun things that we see at the distillery at the Fred Vino is there's a letter to the investors. Of course, we have investors from all over the place. Most of our investors used to be in Chicago, and there's a letter that sits in Fred Vino that is him introducing Booker's to the investors. And there's a response letter that says, oh, hey, like, it'd be cool if you cut down the proof of the whiskey. I don't think it's going to be profitable for us. I don't think this is something that, I think it'd be great. We love the name. We love the concept. We love the concept of unfiltered, of whatever, but maybe cut down on the proof and bring it down to something more accessible. And there's no response letter, but talking to Fred and Freddie, he's like, y'all can go after yourselves. I'm going to release this whiskey the way it is, because this is its purpose and this is what it's supposed to be. So from the beginning, there was this vision that this man had about all the different whiskeys. Like, they all serve their purpose, they all serve their space. And I think that's what makes to your point, I think that's what makes me appreciate the category and Basil Hayden for what it is as well. And I think that's a great segue into Subtle Smoke, which
Perfect.
is our latest innovation.
As we pour that up, I do want to take a second to ask everyone to jump on camera for just a quick moment. I think what you just said a second ago also was a perfect segue into just a little cheers. Just want to say thanks to you for making tonight possible, to good whiskey, to good people. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Cheers, everyone. Pour something in your glass, jump on camera, smile right into the lens. We'll count down to 3. 1, 2, 3. Cheers. Perfect. No, hold on. Of course, Edwin blinked. One more.
Okay. I'll hold still.
Everyone. There we go. Smile. Got it.
I was trying to take a screenshot at the same time you were, I think, and it just like made me. So you can send that to me at some point.
I think you blinked in this one too, but
no.
All right, we'll do one more.
Okay.
Guys. All right,
I promise I'll hold my eyes open for at least 10 seconds.
And there we go. Sean joined us too. So there we go. We'll blame it on Sean. Everyone smile. No, stop looking at the screen. Smile at the camera. There you go. Smile. Got it. All right, everyone's smiling. Perfect. I said smile, and he looked right down, Edwin. So that was great.
It takes practice, Vadim. Some people aren't used to it. That's okay.
No, he's trying to multitask. He's trying to screen grab at the same time as I am.
Wait, did I look down to the last one too?
No, the last one I got it, but like we figured it out. It's all
the
good.
one before, yeah, okay, yeah. I
the
looked
one
down.
before, I was like, smile. You looked, as soon as I said it, you looked down to look at me.
Okay, yeah. So it's funny because I have this this webcam a little elevated, and I have the laptop down here, so it's all wonky.
Yeah.
Right before we go into that Subtle Smoke, I was just gonna say on that 10-year rye, I think it's definitely something that you can introduce people to rye with. Some of your ryes, there's so many things on the market that are really bold, high proof, etc. And in this one, like a lot of, well, I'd say, and a lot of other ones, you get like grassy, peppery notes, stuff that way. This one's kind of tamed down. Definitely get the oak, citrusy, a little bit of the grassy, but overall, like you definitely a good sipper. So yeah, I think oftentimes the surprise, people go, oh, Basil Hayden's, sometimes because of proof stuff, people, might not go that direction, but it's really a nice sipper. So good job.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, very, very nuanced, very subtle. Great intro into the into that style of whiskey. And then we have Basil Hayden Subtle Smoke, which y'all are the very, very first group on the West Coast to be able to taste this in a tasting. Well, it's not on the West Coast, so if anyone's had a chance to taste it somewhere, they might have tasted it on the East Coast, where I think it's just been released. But for sure, like as far as tastings go, you are the first group to ever taste this. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Vadim has the very first pre-production bottle, which was never meant for resale or for tasting. It was just meant for me as my sampling bottle. But I'm happy that I was able to share it with you. Again, Subtle Smoke is a 6-year classic Basil Hayden mash bill that's been finished in hickory barrels or hickory smoked barrels for an additional 3 to 4 weeks, as far is what I've been told. I need to still get clarity on the exact amount of time, because I know there's information, and it's one of those things that I just not get a chance to like discuss at the distillery last time. But it's a very short period of time, because after from what I remember from Fred and Freddie, there's diminishing returns, and it also just ends up tasting slightly bitter. So these barrels have been smoked in very much the same way that I'm sure you all are familiar with like the smoking guns or the smoke cocktails, right? You've got that smoke gun, you're essentially taking that barrel and introducing that very same like hickory smoke chip flavor aroma into the barrel, sealing it up for a couple of hours, opening it up, and then dumping the whiskey, classic Basil Hayden, straight into it. And the product is Basil Hayden Subtle Smoke. I like to call it daytime barbecue. It really gives me like, hey, I'm gonna go hang out at the park or like national park, whatever. For me, it's Griffith Park because it's so close by. Let's go hang out at Griffith Park. Let's take some smoked meats. Let's barbecue a little bit and let's hang out. And I think this whiskey like really embodies that very subtle smoke. Like there's this slightly, somebody said peaty note, but it's got a little like it. Oh, they said peaty or smoky. Yes, I agree. It's like faint barbecue. It's like I took a bite of like smoked brisket and then took a sip of whiskey at the same time. So I get a little bit of both of those flavors kind of developing from that. And yeah, Shane, you're right. It kind of disappears a little bit on the palate. It kind of hangs out more in the mid palate and on the nose. And I think that's the whole purpose of it. I think most Basil Hayden drinkers that drink Basil Hayden as kind of the regular go-to bourbon aren't familiar with that smoke quality. And I feel like this is their introduction into a smoked whiskey, and maybe their gateway into Scotch. Not that was the purpose of it. This is more of just like a fun thing that we wanted to do. I know that just talking to Fred and Freddie, we experimented with a ton of different woods. I know we experimented with cherry wood. I know we experimented with apple wood. Of course, with hickory, mesquite. And at the very end, we finally settled on hickory as kind of the wood of choice, which is really cool. Because at first I thought like, okay, cool. Did we just go straight to hickory? But talking to Fred and Freddie, they were like, nope, we tried a bunch of different woods and they all gave us really funky things. And at the end, we settled on hickory because it gave us the most consistent flavor palette throughout the whole process. So I agree. It's very light, it's very subtle, and it's just a fun little whiskey to kind of hang out and enjoy.
This is fantastic. Thank you for sharing with us.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like if I took a bourbon and took a really good beef jerky. Just use it as a stir. Let it go. And in the best possible way. I mean that as in a complimentary way. It's really excellent.
No, I feel the same way. Have any of you been to Love's before, like on your drives to Vegas or anything like that? So you stop at Love's, you grab yourself a bucket of beef jerky. I mean, you're not gonna drink any whiskey, but it reminds me of that. It reminds me of like chewing on Love's beef jerky and then arriving in Vegas and having a bourbon, and then that flavor is still kind of in my mouth, in the best way possible because I love beef jerky. So. Whiskey and beef jerky, not like, oh, I like this poll. Damon, you're right. I think if you, unless it was very explicit for us people who are used to like heavier, earthier whiskeys, we might have completely missed the fact that it was ever smoked at all. And I think that's part of the nuance of it all. It's very delicate. It's very soft. It's a very, very, very soft, delicate smoke. And I think a lot of people are going to enjoy it as kind of an introduction into those smoky flavors. But if you're already used to those peaty notes, it might not be your thing. And I think that's kind of the beauty of everything Basil Hayden. People it tends to be polarizing. And I kind of love the fact that you can go either way with it. You can either love it or you're like, maybe it's not my thing.
Yeah, it's no High West, right?
No, correct. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah,
That
I'm
High
not putting
West is gonna hit you in the mouth. I love it. It's delicious, but it's gonna hit you in the mouth.
Yeah, it was pretty good. I liked it.
I'm surprised that I guess to your credit, the easier thing would have been for you to put some Basil Hayden into a Lafroy cask, since you already have that part of your family, and be like, oh, here you go, smoke, just like every other brand does it. But you went and did something unique, so that was props. That's really good.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about it a little bit. We could have also introduced just hickory chips into something and like called it a day and like got a like super smoky product at the very end.
It's really smart with the, if you did it the traditional way and smoked the grains, that would mess up your entire production process. Like how you'd have to clean everything, what you'd have to go through, you'd have to split everything, you'd have to dedicate an entire day for, just doing it for that and everything. So you found a way to add smoke while still being a big market, big producer, still doing the mass production, the size you're doing, but you found a way to sneak the smoke in as if you had smoked the grain.
Right, correct. Yeah, I love that. Thanks, Jason.
And so we tried, how many mash bills did we try today?
I
didn't know that the toast had rice in it. That's really cool. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that gets lost on the toast, because the toast, like my mind goes immediately to toasted barrels, not toasted rice. So we tried, let's see, so
the classic and the 10-year are the same mash bill.
Classic on the right. Yep. Toast is a different mash bill, so that's 2. Dark rye is a blend, so that's 3. 10-year rye is 4, and then subtle smoke is the same, so 4 different mash bills.
So subtle smoke is the same as the classic.
It is the same as classic Basil Hayden. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just that introduction of the smoke there.
Very cool. All right,
so
I think everyone,
even though we had like 6 expressions, we had 4 different mash bills from Basil Hayden.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Everyone has voted, and I have collected all the votes. I think last chance, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to give you a chance to guess of what you think was the crowd favorite today.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh,
You gauged the crowd. You saw everybody's reactions. You know your product. What do you think was the king of the hill today?
That's a tough one. I'm gonna say.
Before you say it, I'm willing to wager you're gonna guess wrong.
I think I'm gonna guess wrong. Correct.
I wouldn't have guessed.
I'm gonna go with toast.
Okay. Are you locking it in? Final answer?
Yep. Let's go.
Toast is tied for number 2. Number 1 is dark rye.
Dark rye. Okay.
Yeah, Dark Rye got 5 votes, and then Subtle Smoke and Toast got 3 votes each, and then 1 vote for 10-year and Classic. That's a pretty nice
The Dark
spread.
Rye is always a dark horse. It always blows me away like that. And I love that people love the Dark Rye because it's delicious, but it's never the one that I normally gravitate to, that's going to be people's favorite, but it always ends up being everybody's favorite. And I just didn't want to go there.
Yeah, it's funny because I wouldn't have guessed, but then I always forget that this group definitely has a sweet tooth.
Yeah,
We definitely do like our sweets.
Hey y'all, I'm an order every dessert on the menu kind of person, so I understand. I'm like, I'm just gonna have a bite of everything, so it's delicious. I agree with all of you. Dark Rye is delicious. So I'm glad y'all enjoyed it.
And I would say, in this group, after well over 100 different tastings, getting something like the Dark Rye is very unique, like compared to a lot of the stuff that we've tried. So I think that also gives it the kind of leg up that it's got the unique factor.
That's true. Yeah. Like putting everything in perspective. You're right. Yeah. I think that's one of those things that that's interesting and important to consider as well. You're right.
You know what though? Yeah. After trying all that, I went back. I still had some of the Classic and went back to that, and it's fantastic. It's better the second time around than it was the first. For whatever reason. So good stuff.
Just for fun, I went back and revisited it. So, I think the Classic always has that special place in my heart as kind of the foundation for where everything goes. But again, I'm always a little biased, and I'm always excited about new things that are coming out. So,
can I get a second batch of samples so I could revisit some of these?
Your local Total Wine has them all waiting for you.
Oh, I already ordered the toasted when I'm picking it up in the morning.
Nice.
And I
appreciate it. That's great.
And I actually had the Dark Rye, but I haven't opened it, never tasted it. And so,
I'm glad you got a chance to taste it today.
There may have to be another one ordered. It was only $4 over here. So
nice. And just to kind of give you a little bit of extra knowledge, like the Classic, the Toast, and the 10-year Dark Rye are the 3 permanent expressions. And then everything else will be subjective to availability. I think the 10-year bourbon is like every other year release. And the 10-year rye, that might be the end of the 10-year rye. I haven't heard anything. I haven't seen any other production notes from it, but I know those 3 expressions and the 10-year bourbon, which is every other year, are part of like the Classic lineup. So,
when you say stuff like that's about the end, it raises the price, even if nobody hears it. The 10-year just went up 80% right now.
Right. Like that's only for you. You didn't hear about it.
You mentioned that
I still find the 10-year pretty easily.
Yeah.
You mentioned there's some innovation in the works.
Yeah. So the innovations that are coming out, the other innovation that's coming out this year besides Subtle Smoke is going to be so this is the last year, just FYI, this is the last year that we're doing a yearly innovation, because we're working on so many other things. We're going to move Basil Hayden to an every other year innovation, which I appreciate because it gives us a little bit more time to focus on other things, and focus on like making sure that it's like top notch. So this year, the other thing that's coming up from Basil Hayden will be Basil Hayden red wine finish. So just another
red wine finish, like the Dark Rye, or like actual red wine finish?
No. This one will actually be like red wine cask finish, like in barrels.
Okay. And
so it won't be liquid finished at all. This will be in actual red wine barrels. So I think it came off as an offshoot for. And of course, I know this is you're recording, but this is just, it's all mainly between us. But my understanding, my idea behind this is that I think because Legend was so popular on the East and West Coast, we wanted to find a way to introduce the idea of red wine finishing into to the general public. And so, of course, Basil Hayden being that vehicle to reintroduce things, it kind of offers that kind of moving forward. So
that makes a lot of sense. I think most of the people, or a lot of the folks on the call today, were at our Legion deconstruction last year with Amanda, and I think the red wine finished bourbon was one of the first times we had tried something like that, and I think that was the crowd favorite. So I love that you guys are following through on people saying, "Wow, bring this to us. This is really good."
Yeah, we definitely got a lot of positive response, and all the deconstructions. I know that when we did the deconstruction in San Diego, everyone was like, "Give me more of that red wine finish cask," and it was, I think it was heard loud and clear the distillery. So they're like, "All right, cool. People like it. Let's do it." It's not that it's. I mean, it takes us an additional year to finish. So cool. Let's give people what they want. And that's really Freddie, honestly, listening to, like, really having that pulse on that radar of what's happening in social media and when people are talking about it on Reddit, and like he's on top of all of that. So I like, it's really cool just seeing this whole new vibe that's coming out of the distillery.
So a question, you said the toast is going to be a regular, one of the I forget what term you use, but like the regular offerings. Why is that? Is it like maybe with the brown rice something that's like more sustainable, or what's the idea behind like that being a regular one for you guys?
Yeah, so a lot of it comes down to our partnerships. So we partnered up with a rice farmer in Arkansas, and of course that kind of becomes like multi-year partnership. So we've laid down a lot of barrels with that partnership to make it sustainable, and also they're the what is the farm called? Off the top, I don't remember, but they are a 100% sustainable, renewable rice farmer out of Arkansas. So as Freddie kind of moves into this whole new sustainability kick, he's trying to partner up with people who also have that same ideal. And part of it is just creating long-term sustainable relationships. And they kind of understood each other. So a lot of it is really coming down to that, like, hey, we like you, you like us, let's work together, let's form multi-year deals, let's lay these barrels down for XYZ number of years, and to the point where we can now say, hey, we're going to continue that partnership as long as we can, as long as they can keep producing like really high quality, like heritage grain for us.
Cool.
So, yeah. And there's going to be some other cool sustainability efforts coming in the future. I don't know if all of you know, but Sipsmith and Maker's Mark recently went B Corp. So like, fully really like embracing that sustainability effort. And that's something that Suntory Holdings, who's our parent company, like really wants us to embrace. So now it's the mad rush, not the mad rush, but really like that extra effort that we're all going to put in to like really eventually, of course, the big boys like us, it's going to take a little bit longer, but eventually our goal is that every single distillery that Beam Suntory owns will become a B Corp distillery or fully sustainable. So there's a lot of work going into this. There's a lot of innovation going into it. And, as we kind of move through the years, you're going to see a lot more of that effort kind of go into it, because right now, like we're trying to handle how we use all the spent grain. And right now we're having to pay people to take the spent grain. But at some point, we're hoping to use it for a bunch of other things. We had this whole other meeting about all the cool things that we can make out of it. It blew my mind, but that's all coming down the pipeline at some point. So
like what?
Cool stuff. What was that?
What can you make out of spent grain?
So we're talking about making like CO2, and we're talking like canned like CO2 to sell to other companies. We're talking about making paper out of it. there's a lot of like really cool little weird things that are in works, that are like in part of the whole like research and development global innovation spectrum that they're working on right now. Just testing things out, nothing's really set in stone. It's more of like, let's see what works. Let's see where we can be profitable, but also, like really do something cool for the environment in a cool way. Yeah,
For sure.
Thank you, everyone. Does everyone have any other questions about Basil Hayden in general, with the distillery in general? I know I'll be back in a couple months and rehash a little bit of the history and kind of delve into the other end of it. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you have now.
I think I missed something at the beginning. Did you say that the classic and the 10-year bourbons are a high rye bourbon?
Correct. Yes. So they share the same mash bill, which is high 60s corn, mid 20s, 20 to 23% rye, and then like high single digits. I'm going to say like 9 to 12% malted barley.
Okay, thanks. I just couldn't decide which one that was, because normally everyone will laugh and tell you that I don't like rye. I actually liked the rye.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of people will tell you like, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of high rye or rye whiskeys, but when you let them taste and you're like, oh, that's interesting, very grassy or very earthy, or like depending on what characteristics. But yeah, everyone's always surprised by rye or high ryes.
Yeah. I guess I think of high rye as being a much bigger number. So this is I can drink this level of rye apparently. So
yeah, I mean, one of the funny things that so I have this note in my compendium, in my notes of things that I've taken down, and Fred and Freddie like to call it a Kentucky high rye, because like of course you think of high rye and you think about like really high rye content, but they like to call it a Kentucky high rye. But I like to call it a James E. Beam high rye, because everything else is, like, as I mentioned, like almost 75 to 78% corn. So the fact that we're going 67% to 65% corn, and then the other percentage of rye is a big deviation from what we normally would do.
oh, I like it.
Awesome. Well, look, thank you so much for hanging out with us. This has been absolutely great. I'm not asking anyone to leave. I'm not kicking anybody out, but we're going to turn off the recording and just have a few drams and hang out. So cheers, Edwin. Cheers to Basil Hayden. Cheers to the group. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and we'll see you at the next one.
Cheers to all of you. Hope to see you soon. Thanks.
Bye.